In the marble halls of the Roman Empire, where the gods were believed to walk amongst mortals, there existed a divine being whose power knew no bounds. He was Jupiter, the king of gods, revered by mortals and feared by all. Yet for all his power and grandeur, there was one thing he couldn't control: his growing obsession with a mere slave girl. Her name was Yen, a lowly servant in the household of the wealthy patrician. Her beauty, modest yet striking, it had caught the eye of Jupiter. Though he had kept his interest concealed, his divine nature, his ego, and his position as a ruler of the heavens dedicated that he should never show weakness, never allow himself to be captivated by something as trivial by a mortal. And yet, he couldn't help himself. The soft glow of her skin, the grace with which she moved, the way her eyes sparkled with a quiet defiance. Everything about her drew him like a moth to a flame. Jupiter knew that his god stature had no need for a mortal like Yen. They were beneath him, their existence insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Yet he couldn't stop watching them. He would appear often in the form of a man cloaked in the shadows from a grand villa, hidden from her in the slight, but never out of range, at least of her presence. He would linger there, listening to the soft rhythm of her footsteps, the melody of her voice as she spoke with her fellow servants. It was a form of torment for him, as he found both satisfaction and frustration in knowing that he was so close yet so far from her. Yen, for her part, was unaware of the god's eyes upon her. She had no reason to suspect that a towering statue of intricate carvings and adorned with the villa's walls dedicated to the gods and emperors were not just relics of the past, but held a far more intimate significance. To her, the gods were figures in stories, figures who had little care for simple slave girls like herself. But Jupiter's obsession grew more with each passing day, and soon it manifested into a cruel, subtle action. He was a god who didn't care for the mortal emotions, nor did he have the patience or the hearts of those who he deemed beneath him. He would ensure that Yen's tasks were made harder. Her life was filled with hardship. She would find that her chores almost became too difficult to complete when she was near a statue of him, or that her chores would be interrupted by the divine storms or disturbance that would leave her feeling frustrated and helpless. He found it amusing to watch her struggle, and yet, with every cruel act, his desire for her only deepened. The more he tormented her, the more he longed to see her break, but Yen was not one to be easily broken. Though she was a slave, her spirit was strong. She bore the weight of her hardships with grace, and never allowed the cruelty of the gods or the bittersweet of her masters to strip away from her sense of self. One evening, as she worked alone in the gardens, a soft breeze carrying through the scent of jasmine and rose through the air, Jupiter appeared in front of her. He had taken on the guise of a nobleman, his features handsome and sharp, his powers dark and gleaming with a secret power. "Slave," he said, his voice low and commanding, though there was an undeniable softness to it, a lingering hint of something deeper. "You seem to work tirelessly for someone of your station. That is admirable." Yen looked up, startled. She had not expected anyone to approach her, let alone a nobleman. Her heart raced, but she kept her composure. She bowed her head, her gaze dropping to the ground. Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady, but despite the pounding of her heart, "it is my duty." Jupiter smirked, the corner of his mouth curving slightly as he watched her. There was something about the way she held herself, despite her position, that fascinated him. He had seen many like her in his time, but none of them could ever look a god in the eye. and still maintain their dignity. He stepped closer to her, his voice becoming more intimate, more persuasive. Duty, is that all you know, isn't it? What if I were to offer you something more? What if I could grant you a life behind the solitude, beyond the chains of this wretched world? Ryan lifted her head, slightly meeting his gaze for a brief moment before looking away. She had heard of such promises before, most of them false and empty. She had learned not to trust the words of men who offered riches and power. They were always cruel in their dealings, only offering such gifts to those who they deemed worthy of their attention. I need nothing from you, sir, she said firmly. I am content with my life as is. Jupiter's eyes narrowed slightly, his frustration rising. How dare she reject his offer? How dare she deny the very thing that he, a god, was offering her? His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he concealed it with a tight smile. Very well, he said, his voice cold. But remember, this. You will never be free of the gods, no matter how much you wish it. With that, he turned and vanished, leaving Ryan standing there, a strange chill running down their spine. Despite the warmth in the air, their heart pounded in their chest. They couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was looming over her. The days passed, and Jupiter, despite his obsession, continued to watch her from the shadows. His need was growing even stronger. He became increasingly cruel, ensuring that she suffered in ways that he had never imagined. His actions were no longer just a form of torment. They were an expression of his need for control, for power over her. He wanted to break her, to make her surrender to him. And yet, through all the pain and all the hardship, Ryan remained steadfast. She was no stranger to suffering, but her spirit could not be crushed easily. She continued to work, continued to serve, never once allowing Jupiter to see her at their full extent of inner strength. She would not let him win, no matter how much he tried to break her. In the end, the cruel god found himself nourished by the very thing he sought to destroy, her resilience. And though he could never fully understand the depth of their strength, it was still this very strength that kept her safe from the god's dark influence. Even as he remained obsessed with her, the days following Jupiter's encounter with Ryan were marked by an unsettling tension in the air, as if the very gods themselves were watching, and all of Rome's marble statues carved into their image had eyes that followed her every step. Jupiter had grown impatient. His obsession with a mortal girl had festered into a dark, possessive anger. How dare she reject him? How dare she defy his offer, his divine offer, so freely given without a second thought, for the power he wielded over her life? He could no longer stand for her distance. He reached into her life with his invisible hand, more forcefully, manipulating circumstances to make her work harder and harder, testing her every turn. He would subtly make the weather change. She worked in the fields, making the sun unbearably hot, or the rain torment her, ensuring her days were filled with misery. But despite all that, Ryan remained composed as ever, her determination only growing with the cruel test he set before her. It irritated him to no end. One day, Ryan was standing alone in the garden, cleaning the intricate stone paths that wound through the villa. Jupiter decided he could no longer remain in the shadows. He appeared before her, but this time not cloaked as a nobleman, but his full godly form. His towering figure loomed over her, the thunder clouds swirling ominously around him. His eyes crackled with divine fury. When, unaware of his approach, hummed softly to herself as she scrubbed the stubborn stain off the marble. She paused, but the air seemed to grow colder, the wind stirring around her, and she looked up, as if the very world had held its breath. Startled, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing before her, was the god she had heard in stories. He was much larger than any man. His features were sharp and radiant. His robes were glowing with grace and ancient storm. The power that emanated from him was almost tangible, a suffocating presence that made the earth beneath her seem to tremble. "Wyan," Jupiter spoke. His voice was thundering and deep, and commanding, yet laced with an undercurrent of seething rage. "I've been watching you. I have shown you kindness, and yet you dare to ignore my gifts. You reject what I offer and refuse to acknowledge your place. How do you explain this insolence?" Wyan stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She had seen all the statues of Jupiter, the tall, grand, and awe-inspiring, but never had she ever imagined that the god himself would be so intense. His glowing eyes, with an otherworldly power, bored into her like a storm cloud. Wyan stammered, but her quickly regained her composure. She wasn't one to cower in the face of a god. "I owe you nothing, Jupiter. I do not wish to seek your favor, nor do I wish for your gifts. I am content with the life I lead." Jupiter's fury erupted, his gaze darkened, and the air around them crackled with divine energy. His thunderous voice echoed throughout the garden, shaking the ground beneath her feet. "You dare speak to me as if I'm a mere mortal. Do you know who I am? I am Jupiter, the king of gods. I have the power to destroy this entire world with a single thought, and yet you, a mere slave, stand before me and reject everything I offer." Wen flinched at the force of his words, but she held her ground, her voice steady. "I may be a slave, but I am not yours to command. I belong to no one but myself." Her words only fueled his rage. The ground beneath them began to tremble. The wind whipped around them, tearing at the branches that were on the nearby trees. Jupiter stepped forward, his form towering over her presence. "I have been patient with you," he growled, his eyes flashing with fury. "But you have tested my limits, now you will learn your place." Lan braced herself for impact, her heart pounding in her chest, but the bolt, before it could strike, something inside her snapped. She could no longer allow herself to be a victim of cruelty. No longer could she let him divine her worth. "No," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You will not control me. You will not break me." Jupiter paused, taken aback by the fire in her eyes. "You think you can stand up to me?" he scoffed. "You, a mere mortal, will never be more than a tool for my amusement. You have no power, you have no strength, you are nothing but what I allow you to have." Ryan stood her ground. "Perhaps you are wrong," she replied. "Perhaps you are the one that is weak. You are so consumed by your power that you cannot see that it is cruel. It makes you small. I may be a slave, but I have my dignity and I have my will, and that is something you will never take from me." For the first time, he saw her as not a mere plaything, but as something beneath him, physically, but not in the way he normally saw it. "You," he murmured, but his voice was no longer filled with the sharp harshness. "You have more strength than I gave you credit for." Ryan remained silent. With a sigh, Jupiter spoke again, his voice calmer. "You will not be punished. I will not torment you for any longer." Ryan stood there, still processing the words. The storm had passed. Something within her had shifted too. He had faced a god. She had not broken in the face of a god. Jupiter paused as he turned to leave, but he paused. "If you ever change your mind," he said quietly, "know that you are not entirely without power in this world." Ryan watched as he vanished. The air around her calmed once more. She was left alone, her heart racing. But again, from that day, Jupiter never dared to torment her. His obsession remained, but no longer driven with cruelty. Instead, it was marked by the grudging respect for the strength of the woman he could never truly possess, one who had not only withstood his divine wrath, but had emerged victorious.